Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Vibe Selection. And on today's episode, I have a very special guest joining me today. I have Evidential Psychic Medium, tarot reader, and fellow podcaster joining me from the Blooming Wand podcast, Emily O'Neill. How you doing today, Miss Emily?
I'm doing so good, Kyra. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure. Okay, so hearing people use the term evidential psychic medium or evidential psychic is something that's relatively new to me because I
Yeah.
always thought every psychic came with the evidence. So, can you explain a little bit more for the people what exactly that means?
Well, I do think it's a relatively new term. And I think it's a way for those of us that are trained in a really specific way of providing psychic or mediumistic communication to people. And it's just cluing people into that we are evidence based. So we conduct our sessions in a particular way so that we don't get fed information, so that it's not the possibility of like suggestion is decreased because our minds are definitely susceptible to suggestion. Like I could be suggestive towards you, you could be towards me, and we could, be in that realm rather than I'm getting information from a spirit communicator, I'm passing it on to you. You're not telling me anything other than, yes, I understand that information. No, I don't. Or I might need more information, or I'm not sure. So it's not that there's no dialogue between practitioner and sitter. It's just we try to keep it to a minimum till the very end so that we're giving evidence that's as pure and true and clear as absolutely possible. So it is kind of new. And I know I'm like you, like I used to think all psychics and mediums were
Yeah.
evidence based, but I mean, that's not the case. The level of skill and ability in terms of practitioners is kind of all over the place. And so you don't always know what you're going to get when you sign up for a reading. And so I like to make sure people know when they come to me, how I'm going to work.
Right. So, how do you present them with the evidence?
Well, psychism and mediumship are two different intuitive modalities, and I think that's something that I don't know if everybody knows about that. Frankly, I didn't. I just mushed them all together. I thought it was kind of one and the same thing. But when I work psychically, it's sort of like me and you, so practitioner and client. I'm connecting into your energy. I pick up on things, and then I present them to you, and you see if it resonates. And if it does, you kind of let me know, and then we build from there. So I'm getting information about you without you telling me what's going on in your life.
Mhm.
Um, so do I know exactly where that information comes from? I when I'm working psychically, it's obviously me and the client that I'm working with, and that information comes to me in a variety of different ways. The clair senses being one of them, so we have more than five senses, and I essentially enter into a slightly altered state where my awareness is very, very expansive. I become very passive and receptive, and then I receive the information, and then I just simply pass it on to them. So I can sense that maybe somebody's been having a hard time, or sense that they're really excited about something, or that they might be starting a new job, or that, like, a lot of people come, I think, to psychic mediums because they're looking for answers. They're looking for validation. They're looking for clarity. And so one of the things that I can do is provide them with that without them having to tell me anything. So I'll just start talking and giving information and then checking in to see if it makes sense with my client, and then they'll say, "Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me." And I think it's reassuring because they haven't told me what's going on. I don't want them to tell me anything. I really want to be able to provide them with that information psychically.
Right.
Now, working as a medium is a little bit different. I'm getting the information. I make a link to a spirit communicator, so someone who's passed on, and they give me the information. And in a lot of ways, that's a lot more cut and dry.
Mhm.
Um, so psychism and mediumship work a little bit differently. And when I'm working with a spirit communicator, it's fast, it's clear. It's like I do 30-minute sessions for those as opposed to longer sessions for psychism because the information's like I kind of just have to do less. I just like let the spirit communicator give me all the information and then I pass it on.
I
And
see.
so when we work as evidential psychic mediums, we have to be very careful about how we pass information on. So I'm not really wanting my clients to give me too much information like, "Oh yeah, that makes sense, Emily, because," and then fill in the blank. I like to save that till the end so I can
Mhm.
kind of stay in flow, and I prefer my clients to say, "Yeah, Emily, that makes a ton of sense. I don't know what you're talking about. That's not really clear to me," or I might need more information, or like literally, "No, that doesn't resonate with me." And no's don't upset me or throw me off. Sometimes they're just part of the process. I'm not a machine. I am a human being. So, and sometimes, oftentimes when someone tells me no, though, like a week later, they'll message me back and be like, "Yeah, I told you that didn't make any sense, but now it does." And like all this stuff
Right.
has happened. So
Yeah.
that's why I don't take it personally. I'm like, okay, well, we'll just kind of move on to the next piece of information. And
Right.
the reason, like, I try to kind of have a specific way that I interact with my clients is so I don't get fed information and try to be as true and authentic to the stimulus that I'm receiving so that I can pass it on to the sitter and so that they know that this information is coming psychically or mediumistically or not because I Googled them on the internet or something like that.
Right, exactly. And that you brought up a good point about, with the evidence and, making sure that people, you're not being fed the information and that people are just kind of listening to what's being said so they can kind of hone in on what the meaning behind what you're saying is. So, have you ever dealt with people that have been skeptics that have came to you before and
Yeah.
you had to deal with any pushback from that?
I think, well, I've definitely dealt with skeptics, but sometimes they just don't want to be taken advantage of, and I don't have a problem with that. Like,
Right.
I don't want, but like this has never happened to me, but I've heard from my peers, like other psychic mediums, that it has happened to them where people try to trick them or throw them off, and for me, I'm like, why would you pay me all this money to try to trick me? I can demonstrate this without you doing that, I guess. I haven't ever had that, but um, I have had skeptics who I could like will sit with their arms kind of crossed and they'll feel like a very defensive posture, and I'm totally fine with that. I think we should be skeptical, be honest with you. So my whole attitude about it is when it comes to psychism and mediumship and tarot readings and all of that, be skeptical but curious. So, be mindful about who you're working with, be mindful about the information that's being given to you. I actually have another more challenging aspect of my work is sitters who want to talk a lot and tell me
Yeah.
about their life. So I always
Oh,
tell them,
and I think
I
you're a
reserve the
therapist.
right. Yeah. Well, they'll tell me everything. And I'm like, well, we want this some information to come from your spirit loved one or like this way. That's what you're here for. So I always tell people right at the top, I reserve the right to interrupt you. If I feel like you start giving me too much information, I'm just going to be like, boop, don't tell me that
Disclaimer.
yet. Yeah, save it for the end. I'll always save time at the end for people to share because people really do want to share like how this resonates with them. I know that when I get readings I want to be like, "Oh my God, you want to know why that made sense? Here's why." And I as a practitioner love to hear that, but just like save it to the end because otherwise I get in my mind and I can deal with that like I've been trained to work with that, but it's just really easier the less I know the
Right.
better.
Right. And then, people can know how accurate you are. So if a skeptic comes to you and then you're giving them all of this information that seems to resonate with them, then
Hmm.
that's clarity that yes, there are real people out here that really do know
Yeah.
information that they couldn't have known. And there really is spirit out there
Yeah.
and there really is a God.
Yeah, it's very, and I think the other thing that, there's a lot going on with psychism and mediumship now. It's become very popular. You see a lot of stuff on social media and online, and to varying degrees, it's awesome, and some of it's not that good. But
Mhm.
one of the things that I always tell people is sometimes people get in their heads the type of evidence that they want to hear, like, tell me my birth date. It's like it doesn't exactly work that way. Evidence comes in all kinds of shapes, sizes, and forms. So as long as the information can be validated, just sort of accept that for what it is. And typically, information will build going kind of from broad towards specific. So sometimes people come to me and they really want to hear a specific piece of evidence to prove that their spirit loved one is there. And oftentimes I'm able to get there, but not always. And they'll kind of like throw all the other evidence out because this one thing didn't come through. And it's like, well, that's kind of a bummer because we had all this other evidence that you did validate.
Right.
So we have to really, like I said, that skeptical but curious mindset's really, really helpful, and just understanding that um, it's not an exact science, psychism and mediumship. It's a little bit of an art, and we don't have a ton of control over the information that we receive. And I think that's another thing. We just get what we get, and we have to ride that wave and really go with the flow. And I had some readings yesterday, and boy, did I really have to like relax and go with the flow because it was like one little piece came and then another little piece came. I'll give you an example so your listeners know what I mean, because I think examples really give context to this type of thing. So, I was working with a sitter, and her father had come through, and I could tell, like, we had gone through validating who it was, lots of pieces of evidence, and I could tell he was trying to get a message to her. And I
Hmm.
was like, he's bringing up this car, and like that you still have a car that he was connected with. And she's like, yes, I have the car. And I knew he didn't want to talk about the car, but he was bringing me to the car. I was like,
Hmm.
okay, so he's bringing me to the car. And then I'm like, hold on. And I had to wait for the next wave. But I'm like, he's bringing me to the car. He's talking about how driving and going places is like a metaphor for something. And I had to wait for the next piece to come. It's a metaphor for life. And I'm like, it makes me feel like it's something about life being a journey. And I'm like, and do you have like an object or something that would be connected to this? And she's like, oh my God. Because first she thought it was just about the car, that she had the car. And I'm like, no, there's more. He's giving me more. And she had this little card that she had made because his favorite phrase to say was life's journey,
Hmm.
not a destination. And she keeps it in that car and her car altar. And I was like, I feel like there's some kind of object connected with this. And then she literally had it right there. And so, but that information came in one little bit,
Hmm.
another little bit, another little bit. It doesn't come in like whole paragraphs that we speak. It's like learning a different language, and it's very sensory oriented. So I get impressions and senses and feelings, and I just have to say it as it comes and hope that the next piece of information kind of falls on the heels of the piece of information I'd previously given. And it's
Hmm.
just you really have to be in the flow and trust. And so that was one where I was like, okay, I've got one piece, and then I told her we just have to wait for the next piece. And boy, she wanted to fill in the gaps with that, and I was like, no, no, don't say anything.
Sorry, this is a
We're
puzzle, and we got to
yeah,
take each
we're gonna
piece
get there.
step
We're
by
gonna
step,
get there.
and we will
And when
make this complete picture.
it did though. It just took it took, a couple of minutes, but we got there, and it was like she's like, "Oh my God, like this is I keep this with me. This is what he says." And she's like, "There's no way you would have known that." And
Right.
so I felt like that was just a really special kind of piece of evidence and message that he's very much with her still, and he knows that she is sort of working with that affirmation that life is really a journey and not a destination, and that being an important value that she and her father shared. And it was just really awesome, and thought I'd share that as an example of kind of how that information might flow or come through or what evidence might look like.
Right. And I mean, it's also comforting to know that a loved one that may have passed on is still with you, still, helping you along the way, watching over you, protecting you, or just coming to check in on you. Because
Oh, yeah.
I'm pretty sure there are some people that probably come to you as a medium that want to, talk to their loved one every week or something like that. And it's like, okay, now like you kind of got to move on with your life too. So
Mm-hmm.
at least if you know that that loved one that's passed on, whether it was a tragic death or not,
Yeah.
they're still there with you. So you don't have to always come to a medium to channel them. You
That's
can.
actually a really good point, Kyra, and I'm glad you brought it up because you do not need a medium to
Mhm.
communicate with your spirit, your loved ones. They're there, they hear you. I love the idea of altar spaces for loved ones that have departed that we want to stay in connection with. In fact, those that do keep kind of a picture out or think of people through a song or a special dish they like to eat, they'll bring like spirit communicators will bring up like, I know you're doing that. That just happened like a couple of weeks ago. I'm like, oh, they're telling me you've got an altar with them on it, and this is what this is what's in the picture. And she's like, yeah, I keep that out. This was connected to Dia de los Muertos,
Mm.
and I was able to connect those dots too for the sitter, and they know and they love it. They live within us, right? Because of the love. Our love for them never dies, and
Right.
that's the connection that keeps everything going. And you can just place a hand on your heart and close your eyes and say hello and commune with them anytime you want. But I will say that working with a medium can be helpful to healing through the grief process. I recently had a client who helped her mother pass, so she kind of walked her mother home to the great beyond. Um, and she just like, Emily, I can't get over it. I don't know why. And I was like, well, let's see if she'll come through today. Of
Mhm.
course, she did. With lots of her mom was like this spirit communicator was such a clear like she just gave me so much information. I'm like, I feel like your mom was a chatty Cathy in real life because she's really chatty here. And she's like, that's exactly how my mom would describe herself. And so this sitter asked me for some specifics around the passing. She's like, do you think, does she know what I said to her when she was unconscious? And I was able to get that what she had said to her and just how the passing went. And then she said, Emily, is my mom okay? And I said, we'd done this whole reading. I'm like, she's more than okay. Of course she's okay. And she's with you. And she's like, I think I just needed to hear that. And I feel really relieved now. And afterwards, she sent me an email that said, like, I feel like a weight has been lifted off me because I just needed to know my mom was okay and that I could still talk to her. And I'm just like, was so happy to provide her with the opportunity to know, yeah, your mom is totally okay. I think that people come to mediums with different needs. Some of us are very much in the grief process and we really want to hear from someone specific. Some
Mhm.
people are more curious about it and they have some loved ones on the other side, but they're just wondering how this works, or um, they want to have deep in their spiritual practices and things like that. And so, and I will also say that, not all of us have great relationships with people that have passed on.
Yeah.
And so we're complicated people in life, and so
Mhm.
people will pass away, and maybe you want to hear from them, but maybe what you really need to hear from them is, I'm sorry. And then there are people who are like, I want to hear from person A, but I really don't want to hear from person B because they were not a good person in life. They did terrible things to me. And I always tell people that spirit is intelligent. I've never had anybody come forward that was harmful or that someone didn't want to hear from because they had hurt them really bad or done terrible things to them. It has a funny way of working itself out, and I think that that's really interesting. Do I know exactly how that works? No, but I do have a deep trust in spirit, and I know that they bring the things in that we need
Mhm.
when we need it, and that no harm isn't ever intended or has been done, at least through the work that I've done. Um, but people are complicated, and complicated people do come through for for my clients, and a lot of times it's to help promote healing.
Mhm.
The other interesting thing that can happen, and this happened to me a lot, so I did many years of development with the Oakbridge Institute, and so I was in practice circles a lot where there was a group of us basically practicing doing readings on each other. And for years, all these different, developing mediums were giving me information on a man on the other side. And they were like, I'm pretty sure it's your grandpa. Well, one of my grandfathers I had never met because he passed away. This is my mother's father when my mother was 8. So I don't know anything about him. But he came through a lot, but I was like, maybe the information you're giving me is true, but I have no way of validating it. I have literally no way because I never met him.
Right.
And so I would just kind of let those readings go and, continue on. And then 3 years later, fast
Uh-huh.
forward 3 years, I had to do some work in my parents' garage, and um, we come across this box, and it's filled with this beautiful, amazing photo album my grandmother made about the time she shared with my grandfather, who I had never met, and everything in there, because I keep notes when I was in practice circle. I went and looked at all of it was validatable. All of it was true. It just took 3 years for me to put it together. And I was like, oh my gosh, this man who I've never met is so close to me, and provided all this evidence. It's just, I didn't know. And my mom was like, I'm not sure about that because, she was only 8 when he passed. But that photo album solved the mystery. And so the readings can happen that way too. And I think I really like to share that with people because I feel like you go to a medium and you think, there's like, you see things on TV like Tyler Henry, the Hollywood medium, or like the Long Island medium, and you think that's the way it is. And that is in part the way that it is, but it actually comes in so many other flavors and colors that don't get edited for TV. And
Mhm.
I think it's important for people to know that. And that's why working with like an ethical practitioner who has had maybe some development is helpful, because we make an effort to like share kind of these stories and these things and how we want to provide information and why we want to work with you in the way we do to maintain a high level of care. So so that the standard of care in the industry is sort of raised. So like, here's what you can expect from an ethical practitioner, which I think is so important. And I'll just say this before I kind of take a pause. There is a school of thought that I feel I should acknowledge, where there are mediums who say they were just born this way and they just know how to do it and they haven't had any training and development. And fair enough, I think that that's fine. But one of the things I've learned and that I value is I know I don't learn and grow in the absence of other people, that I need a community to fail, fall flat in front of that can lift me back up when I need to maybe refine some of my skills and abilities. So it's like we don't really learn and grow in a silo or without other people. It's good to have a community to practice with, because being a medium is hard. I'm not going to lie. It's kind of stressful.
Mhm.
Before I ever do sessions, I always have this moment where I'm like, is this even going to work today? Because I don't know if it is. Like, I really don't. Um, and it's deep work, and so it's nice to have other mediums to be like, oh man, you're never going to believe what happened today, or guess what I learned, and kind of share it with others. I don't think we have to walk this path alone, and um, we don't have to like prove anything to anybody. There doesn't need to be like any kind of competition and stuff like that. I just really value. I had a great community to learn and grow in, and I was like, dang, I don't know if I could have blossomed or learned what I had without them. And I'm so grateful for that experience. So,
And this is a great point to kind of segue into because I feel like because I have abilities myself,
yeah,
and one of the hardest things is also for me, it was like telling people that I have abilities because a lot of times you're getting oh, so you think you know everything? Or when like you're
yeah,
giving information, it's like, people sometimes are like, well, I don't either recognize that or why didn't you recognize this particular point? And it's
mm-hmm,
just like sometimes that's it, just information that you weren't supposed to know in that moment. And maybe you just
mm-hmm,
needed to live out that experience to see it for yourself. I know that you've said before, like you just get the messages and whatever comes to you, you just kind of work with that. And
mm-hmm,
that's usually kind of how it is. But I think also people don't realize that we're human as well because people
yeah,
think that as psychics and mediums, you're perfect and you know every single thing.
yeah.
And so for me, my question would be to you, how do you find like how are you able to find a sense of counsel to deal with your issues in your life? Because we have issues too
Oh my God,
with
yeah.
mediums.
That is such a good point. So when you said earlier, like telling people that you can do this, it's like kind of a coming out, like because people have
100%.
opinions about it,
Yeah.
and some people are supportive and some people aren't, and some people are like just not going to talk to you about it.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Like I was a little scared to tell people that I was doing this for a living, and that I had these abilities, and some people are okay with it and some aren't, and I'm just like, not my problem.
Yeah.
Do what you do your thing.
Mhm.
Now, but in terms of, you know, dealing with being a human being who is flawed. Like we're all hopelessly flawed to some extent, right?
Yeah.
I I can tell you that 90% of my development, as far as my intuitive abilities, which include psychism and mediumship and all the things, was personal development. And my issues do have the potential of blocking my ability to enter into this passive and receptive state, receive information, and pass it on. So if I had a really stressful day or got in a fight with somebody right before I'm supposed to do readings, it's going to be hard for me because I'm probably wound up to enter into that state and work, right? So I have learned some tools and techniques to set that aside so that I can work. But there was a time where I couldn't set those things aside, and it was hard for me to work because I'd be like, oh, I'm really mad at so and so. And like your emotions, intense emotions, can consume your sphere of awareness, which can make it hard for you to enter into that passive and receptive state. So I had to learn how to deal with that.
Mhm.
My number one thing I think that came up for me, and I'm still working on it,
Yeah.
is perfectionism. I
Mm.
want to give a perfect reading. I want everything to go a certain way. I want it to be a home run every time. And, I just want to do a good job and I want to do no harm. And that desire, while on the surface may seem okay, like, okay, yeah, you just want to do a good job, Em. What's the big deal? Well, if you become too obsessed with that, you're going to be in your head. And
Mhm.
you don't want to be in your head when you're doing this work because it's not coming from our brain, like the information. It's coming from these other than five senses, being in a passive and receptive state. And perfectionism in a lot of ways is destructive. It comes off as like, I just want to be a good girl. And well, that can actually be kind of cause harm. So I don't need to know it all. I don't need to be perfect to do this work. I need to recognize my limitations. I need to recognize where I need growth and development. And that means being radically honest with myself by cultivating a practice of being self aware. And number one, I think this is the biggest thing, is being able to acknowledge when I've made a mistake,
Mm.
when I have maybe put my foot in my mouth, or when I need to, step back and be like, hey, so and so, you've raised a good point. I need to take this on board and think about it. So, this idea that I have to know everything and be a perfect human being, I really had to do a lot of work on like letting that go because that's not attainable. And it actually affected my ability to work. And when I went into development, it paralyzed me. So I would get like a spirit communicator and I would just be like, paralyzed because I'm like, well, if I don't say this just the exact right way, the sitter's not going to be able to take it. And it like made me not be able to be in the flow. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of things that can stop us from being able to do, like, be in the kind of pure flow of the work. And fear and perfectionism and all that was a huge thing. I had to do a lot of work around that, including get a good therapist because it
Help
was
too.
like affecting things. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh man, I need to do a lot of self work to be able to run my business and do this work. And I kind of thought that that would be the case, but when it happens to you and you really take it on board and realize it, I'm like, yeah, this is a big part of being able to work as a psychic medium is personal development. And I would argue that for me, it was like 90% of it.
Yeah. Because I think people forget, like we're here to live the same human experience that everybody else is. Our experience is just a little bit different. And,
Yeah.
as a psychic, you're just a little bit more connected to a sense of self and
Yep.
your higher good, and that's how we come into the information that we know oftentimes without even really knowing how we know or why we know or getting vibes off of
Yep.
people and things like that. But we also have to work on ourselves and not get so lost and so caught up in helping others where we
Yeah.
forget ourselves, you know.
That's a really, really good point. And I always tell myself, Emily, these readings aren't for you. They're for the people that you work with. I do not need to understand the information. I don't need it, it doesn't need to be a certain thing or look a certain way. It's like you give it and you let it go. And you
Mm.
just kind of have to move on. And I'll admit that that's sometimes hard for me, and that there are people I've worked with who I think about and that stick with me for sure. But I do agree with you that people do sometimes think we know everything, like the lottery numbers and stuff like that. Or
Right.
like,
Man,
I'm
come
like, no,
on.
I don't.
I
I
didn't
mean,
give
if I
them to
could,
you.
yeah,
I take them for
if I,
myself.
I know, but even if I could, should I be using it in that
Right.
way? And so, or that we just, I don't know, people, but I know what you're talking about, that people have this idea that somehow we're more spiritually evolved. Not necessarily. Like, I have worked with psychic mediums where they've said and done things where I'm like, they're definitely a psychic medium. They definitely have the skill and ability. But sometimes some of the things they do, it's like, I would never tell somebody you're going to die. And I've seen a psychic medium do that. I was like, oh
Oh my
my
God.
God. Like, why would you
Oh
say that to
no.
somebody? Or,
Right.
like, there's like, that's what I mean about the ethics. It's like, you maybe you do know that, but I mean, how is that going to be helpful to say to somebody? Like,
Right.
I don't know that that's in alignment with my values and ethics, but I know that that's an extreme example, but I've seen things on the interwebs that I'm like, oh my God, I cannot believe they're saying that to somebody. And people not realizing there, about it's like, again, back to like, what is ethical? And I think we all have different opinions about that. But for me, I know that I want things to be in service to people's highest good.
Mhm.
And for me, the information that comes through, usually it is. And so I don't have a ton of worry about, oh, should I say what I'm getting? I have had to know things, difficult things were coming for people. And I present them in a way that I think will be helpful, not scare them. I always tell people this is to make you aware, not to scare. And I think that that's been helpful. But like, to your point of not knowing everything, I always tell clients, email me, like, the door isn't closed just after your session if you have questions, because like, education, then like helping people understand how this works is important to me. And I
Mhm.
had a client a couple of years ago who came and we got a lot of information. It was for a psychic reading about some changes in her life, a new job, and a developing relationship and stuff like that. And then a week later, she got in a car accident, and she's like, how come you didn't tell me about this accident? I was like, well, for one, I didn't get any information about it. I,
Mm.
I literally didn't think anything about you being in a car accident. And I said, and for two, if I had told you last week, oh, and by the way, you're going to get in a wreck next week, would that have been helpful to you? And she's like, no, never mind. Like, no, that would have just freaked me out and given me terrible anxiety, and I already have anxiety. And I was like, yeah, there's an intelligence there, and also nothing is locked in place is another thing that I've learned. So I often am presenting possibilities to people, and do a lot of times these things unfold. Yeah, do they always? No. And I think that's because we do make different choices in our lives and can change direction and things like that. It's not like you get a reading and it's like, well, I guess this is just the only thing that's possible for me and there's no other option. I'm like, no, I mean, if you don't, for example, people choosing different careers, that's a big thing. People wanting to make career changes kind of coming in. I'll be like, well, you have these options in front of you, but oh, I always tell people there could be others. Like, don't just like take your perspective and zero in on it because of what I said. If you're interested in other things, always listen to your intuition and how
Right.
you feel. I don't just let me dictate things to you. And that's why I spend I do one-off readings. I'm so happy to do them, psychic readings, and I love working mediumistically, like helping people heal from losing loved ones. But there's this other thing I like to do, which is intuitive development, like helping people learn what their inner guidance system is saying to them, what their relationship with it is, because it's so empowering when you start to connect with your intuition. You and I, like, we know, like,
Right.
and I just want to share that with people. And I always say there's a lot of valid reasons why we have maybe a difficult relationship with our intuitive self. Trauma, life, different types of emotional and spiritual bypassing that just kind of happen because of our experiences. And not wanting to listen to our intuition because, listen, let's be honest. Is it always telling us like what we want to hear? No.
Nope.
Most of the time it's telling us
No.
you might need to change course or you might need to make some changes. And so it's why do we not listen to that? That's what I'm interested in is why is it that we have this amazing superpower and everybody has it. We all have access to this that we do not want to commune with it. And this isn't a criticism or a judgment on why we do that. It's just interesting to me. Like, why is it? Why is that so hard for us? And I think that cultivating a relationship with our intuition is almost like a coming home to ourselves. It's like, oh, there I am. Huh. Nice to meet you. Let's work together instead of sort of rejecting that aspect of who we are. And I think a lot of it has to do with our country of origin or where you're raised or the household in which you were raised. Religious views are a big one that come into play with getting in touch with our intuition. So
Mhm.
that's like my favorite thing to do, to be honest with you. It's been such a profound experience for me to develop my intuitive abilities. And I tell people, you don't have to become a psychic medium and work with the public. This is a life skill. This is just helpful in general. And I feel like it's also kind of a spiritual practice. So, like for me, tarot is a spiritual practice. Like I use it as a tool to help me understand myself and what's going on within me. It's a big part of like my creative work, writing, art, drawing, painting. It inspires so much. So that's like my favorite thing is helping people connect with that within themselves.
So how does one connect with their intuition? Say they've been non-believers or have certain religious views where it's
hmm
kind of held them back from being able to tap
hmm
into that. How do they get in tune with it?
Well, I think the first thing is you have to have the desire. You have to want to.
Yes.
So, do you even want to? If you don't, fair enough. Go on with your bad self. Like go on that path. I have no judgment or criticism of that. But for people who are like, I've heard the whisper, the internal whisper, and I didn't listen to it. And I'm curious as to why I didn't listen to it. And I'm like, okay, let's figure that out. It's not really all that complicated, the process. It's pretty simple. And I always tell people, but simple doesn't mean easy. It's just
Right.
simple steps. And I think the number one thing is begin to cultivate quiet time alone. I
Mm.
mean, no phone, like downtime if you can, and it can just be 10 minutes a day. It does, we don't, I like to meditate sometimes up to 45 minutes a day because it feels good to me at this point, and I feel like a weirdo if I don't do it. But it doesn't have to be like that. You can find a way that works for you to have like 10 minutes, maybe more a day where it's like my phone is off. I'm just like kind of quietly breathing. And I always tell people stare out the window or bring your awareness to your breath, just the simple rise and fall of your breath, and begin to notice, do I have a kind of a mind that's bouncing around? Am I wanting to daydream or worry about things? Just notice how you're reacting to that quiet time alone because that's really good information. And then do it again the next day and see how that goes because one of the things you begin to realize is every time you have your quiet time, it's different.
Mhm.
And that's good. And your nervous system begins to like the quiet time. Initially it might like be like, kind of buzzing and like, I need to be doing something. So we work our way into it because the reality is that we want to begin to cultivate an ability to be passive and receptive so we can hear the voice, so we can understand what's going on within us. It also requires some awareness of the body. So that's why I say quiet time alone and bring your awareness to your inhale and your exhale because you'll notice sensations in your body, discomfort and things like that. And sometimes that's emotion wanting to come forward and communicate with you. And we all have different abilities to be in our body. I used to think, oh, everybody can just be in their body, and that's not true. Everybody's different. Like some people are more in their head, and that's easier. Some people can't really visualize things, which I learned through doing my work because visualization is part of what I offer to people as a tool to get in touch with their intuition. And they'll be like, I just don't see anything with visualization. I'm like, okay. And so we try different paths. So I think if you just have to find what works for you, but the first thing is just cultivate quiet time alone and notice what you notice.
Mhm.
And I tell people this really helped me is I like to work with this concept of the sphere of awareness. So I just imagine my awareness as a circle. And so when I sit to do my quiet time alone, I visualize this sphere and I say, what's filling my sphere today? Oh, you know, I'm worried about um, so and so because they're not doing well. I'm feeling anxious. My cat is really sick and I need to take her to the vet and I know it's going to be expensive. My stomach hurts. Oh, my period's going to come. So it's like you list what's all in that sphere and you'll realize that it's very full. But your brain likes to list things out and it sort of like releases once you acknowledge the thoughts. And so if I know that my sphere is full, I just say, I'm going to soften and make it bigger. I'm going to make room for some nothingness, some spaciousness. And so that's just like it's simple. It sounds really simple, but I think why people like to have someone help them initially with this is it's kind of hard to do it on your own. I know that I needed a little bit of help and support initially, somebody kind of holding space for me and noticing, oh, I notice, Emily, that you're kind of reacting this way to this, or this is kind of coming up for you, and to be like, yeah, well, what do I do about that? And then being able to guide me through a process and be like, oh, that's what I can do. But you can do a lot on your own. And I have two free things in my shop at bloomingwand.com to help people with this. It's called the Blooming Wand 6-part check-in process. There's a PDF and an audio guided version, and I have tons of other free stuff in there too for people that are interested in tarot. And that's kind of what I offer to people initially is like, can you do this 6-part check-in process? How did it go? Let me know, because that's going to tell us where your little trailheads are, what we need to work on are. And it's essentially just asking you to first become aware of your breath, just sitting with it, noticing the qualities of your breath and being able to describe the breath. So like, is it deep? Is it shallow? Is it shy? Is it jagged? Is it lacking a consistent rhythm? You just kind of learn to describe it. And then we go into the mind, the body, our emotional self, and into our spirit, like connecting to our higher self.
Mhm.
And then the last part is just you accept the experience of the 6-part check-in for what it is. You don't try to like make it anything that it's not, and you just put it aside and you try it again the next day. And it just helps people cultivate that quiet time alone and begin to notice what they're aware of. It's like a funny phrase. I always laugh when I say it. You become aware of what you're aware of. And it's like this weird
Yeah.
thing, but it's true. It's essentially what it does is you're training your awareness.
Right.
And um, that's what I started with was the 6-part check-in. I made it up for me.
Mhm.
Like I was like, oh, this will help me. And I'm like, oh, this will probably help other people. But almost everybody that downloads it will shoot me an email and be like, this is hard to do on my own. I'm like, I know. If you need help, I'll like,
I
let's
got
get
you.
some time together. But I want people to have access to like some free stuff so they can try it out to see like, do I even want to commit the time?
Right.
Because we all know that if you want to get good at something, right, you have to spend a little time on it.
Exactly.
Um, and so sometimes I'm like, that was too hard. I don't want to do it. I'm like, okay, didn't cost you anything, and you don't have to do anything you don't want to. But usually, I would say probably like mm, 9 out of the 10 people that download it, they'll do it for a while and then they'll be like, yeah, that did make a difference. This has definitely made a difference and something is happening. Like I'm starting to become more attuned to my intuitive self.
Hmm.
And again, I always remind people you can do a lot on your own, but we're
Mm.
not meant to do everything on our own. And I'm not saying, oh, you have to work with me or anything, not at all. But again, it helps to have community and it helps to have people where we can share our experiences, ask questions, all of that kind of stuff. Because as we said earlier in our conversation, our personal stuff comes up when we want to connect with our intuition. Like all of the little gremlins start to come out and we start to be like, oh my God, what
They're
is
out.
going on inside of me? It's like, yep, but that's part of the process and we needn't fear it. It's actually means we're getting somewhere when that starts to happen. And I'm like, some of my clients like, geez, and I roll their eyes. I'm like, oh, I'm so glad the gremlins are out. This means like, yay, we get to do the good work. And they're like, this is so hard. And I'm like, I'm here for you. It's okay. But it's like, what's there? Sometimes they're like, what is happening? Like you're becoming aware of what is going on within you, of your inner landscape. And there's some things in there that really want your attention and love, usually coming in the form of uncomfortable emotion, frankly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And for me, when I hopped out of the broom closet, it was during
Yeah.
the pandemic because,
Same.
in California here, we were on a full lockdown, couldn't go anywhere. So because I'm in a sense of just being still and stationary, I
Yeah.
can now hone in on these things that I knew were dormant inside of me, but now they're able to kind of come out. And one of the things that kind of I struggled with was tapping into my abilities to see things because I've always been able to see things,
Mm-hmm.
but I became afraid of what I was seeing. So I kind of shut that down.
Yeah.
And so when I started to tap into my abilities, I started to see things. And then I was becoming afraid of what I was seeing and
Yeah.
shutting down. And
Yeah.
so that's something that I still struggle with to this day. So for anyone who is tapping into their intuition that starts to tap into the ability of sight,
Uh-huh.
what can you kind of say to them to relieve them of any fears of what they may be seeing?
There's a couple of things. So so we're talking about clairvoyance here, clear seeing. I there are many clear senses. And so when clairvoyance happens, the question I always feel into is this my mind or is this my intuition? And the what really helps me is I pair it with another clairsense. So like the vision comes, and then personally for me, I tap into clairsentience. There's the vision, and then there's a feeling. And what is that relationship between the vision and the feeling? And sometimes these visions are just that. Like maybe they're just I don't know where they come from, to be honest with you. But when I can cultivate a connection between the clairvoyance and the clairsentience and the claircognizance, the clear knowing, and then sometimes there's like clear taste, clear smell, where we pick up on smells and sensations. That tends to ground it a little bit more, and I get a better sense of why this visual is coming to me. An example I could tell you, and this is a very simple one, not necessarily a scary example, but I think it's a good example that demonstrates what you're talking about is an apple. So like some people are like, I'm seeing an apple. Well, to me, that could mean a teacher. It could mean the Big Apple, like New York City. It could mean like farming or an orchard. It could mean just education, right? So it's like, oh, the vision of the apple has come to me. What the hell does an apple mean? The feeling, so you get the vision of the apple, and what's the feeling that comes with it? Oh, this feels like New York, the Big Apple. And you see what I mean? Does that make sense? You kind of pair it with some of the other clear senses. It grounds that visual and gives it context,
Right.
deeper context that's like, oh, that's because you could get a really weird, scary image and then you ground into it and it's like connected to a movie. You see what I mean? Like, so you kind of pair it with these other things.
Mhm.
That has been, so you leaning into all as many of your clear senses as you can. Like, and it's actually they want to come together. They actually always are working together. It's just I feel like there's an emphasis on clairvoyance, clear seeing, and I'm like I could get why that is, but there's other ones that are usually helping out with that. So hopefully that kind of makes sense.
It does. It definitely does. It gives a little bit more insight into how we're using how it's vital to use all of your senses to be able to tap into that
Yeah.
ability and to not be afraid of what you
Mm-hmm.
are going to see. And not every scary imagery that may initially pop up means something bad or is going to be like this big bloody gore scene,
Yeah.
or anything like that. But
The
sometimes
other thing, it's funny. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I was like, oh, I have to say say this is you got me thinking about something. So dreams.
yeah,
Dream journaling and paying attention to your dreams if you're tapping into your intuition is so
yeah.
freaking helpful. Because you know the nine of swords in the tarot where the person's in the bed and they're up crying and the swords are stabbing him in the back, but they're in a
Mhm.
bed, right?
Mhm.
I have always seen that card as like the anxious nightmares card. Like
Mhm.
I'm fine during the day and then I go to sleep and all of a sudden like all these things, these crazy scary dreams are happening and it's freaking me out and I'm stressed out by the dreams. So sometimes those visions come in dreams, sometimes they don't. So like maybe you're just having some visions, but maybe you're actually having some crazy dreams. But during the day you're fine.
Mhm.
Your system's trying to tell you something.
Oh yeah.
You got some anxiety. So there's something
Mhm.
in you that you need to address around fear, anxiety, control,
Mhm.
maybe boundaries. So it's like, but sometimes people think that this is outside of them. Like I'm having a vision of the future, which I wouldn't say isn't possible. I mean, like I know that that is something that can occur. But I would say more times than not, at least in my experience and working with people, it's actually a result of internalized fear and anxiety.
Mm.
Yes. And then we have some work to do there,
Right.
around why that's happening.
Right. And so when those issues may arise when you're working with someone, how do you kind of tap into that to be able to kind of to relieve them of that fear or that anxiety that they may be dealing with?
Well, first I have to check in to make sure that they have the capacity to be with it, right? So sometimes it's like, no, I'm too tired and exhausted. I've had a hard day. I do not have the energy to journey with this emotion right now. And we accept that and we will address it when they do. So
Mhm.
first we have to have consent around like, do you feel like you can do this today?
Mhm.
If they say yes, then we journey with it. And I use the body. So I'm like, where, rather than the thoughts and the visions, I say, well, set that aside for a second. Like, let that kind of hover over off to the side. We're not dismissing it. We're just not going to make that the central focus. Then we do a body scan. We drop deeply into the body, and I'm like, where do you feel this? What feeling in your body? And we go to the feeling in the body, and then we begin to describe the sensations like, oh, it's like my stomach, I feel like a stabbing pain in my stomach.
Mhm.
And then I ask them, can you be open and curious about this feeling? So you have to have that open curiosity to be in the presence of the fear. Like if it's all fear, then we don't have the capacity to journey with it. Does that kind of add up, like make sense? If it's because then we're going to be in a state of all consuming fear. So we have
Mhm.
to kind of carry some compassion and love. And I'll say, with an open heart, can you hold space for this stabbing pain in your stomach? And if they say yes, then we kind of go to the next step is, how is this, ask this feeling why it's here. Like you literally ask it like it's a person you know and a friend, like, why are you here? And then they soften their awareness. And this is where their intuition kind of comes forward and their higher self, because I feel out of control. And it will tell them. And so it's quite a deep process that, I walk them through. But at the end, I've never had somebody tell me like, oh, that was awful. They're like, I feel so relieved. I feel 10 pounds lighter. I had no idea I was carrying that within myself. I didn't know that was there. And so I'm like, well, we all have that within us, but we bypass it. This is where spiritual and emotional bypassing comes in. It's like, ew, that feels icky. Bypass. Like, I don't want to deal with you. Very human response to difficult things. And so it's a tender process, but I mean, I'm very comfortable guiding people through it and I kind of know what the boundaries are. And there are some times where I just have to say to somebody, let's get you connected with a therapist. Like, because there's like maybe some other tools that would be beneficial to them, that I can't offer. So I know what I can do and kind of what the boundaries are around that. But I mean, I've been able to help a lot of people with those types of things. And it's very rewarding for both of us, like those that are doing it with me and for myself, because, like I said, I mean, we want to think of ourselves as like all the things maybe that feel good or that look good, but we're made up of some things that don't feel so good and that are dark, the shadow work, the shadow self. It's very important to recognize the value of those parts of who we are as well. And they often hold like the deepest jewels of wisdom.
Right. And as when you start to hone in on your abilities and things like that, you oftentimes come across other people that may be going through some of the similar things that you may be experiencing in your life.
Mm-hmm.
or you may just be reevaluating the people that you have in your inner circle, whether that's friends, family, distant relatives, whatever. And you, in that journey of learning more about yourself, may come across some very uncomfortable truths that
Yep.
you, in conversations you may have to have with some of those people that are in your life. Maybe you
Yep.
have a very toxic relationship with your mom or your
Yep.
dad, or a distant relative or a friend, or
Yeah.
even a relationship that you have with someone, maybe
Mhm.
a physical relationship. So
Mhm.
how can, in that time when we're working on ourselves, protect our peace and to let go of things that are not for our higher good?
That's a really good question, and I think at the end of the day, we have to not take ownership of people's perception of us. That's really none of our business. We have no control over that. So if people are looking at us and saying, "Oh, you've changed because we've decided to set a boundary." Like, what's wrong with her? Like she like one of the big ones is you know, maybe you don't want to be around people that gossip a lot. And so you just tell people like, "Oh, I don't really stay in conversations where we're talking about people who aren't here." Um, Not that all gossip is bad, I'm not saying that, but like sometimes it gets to a level where it's like, I don't think this is helpful.
Right.
Um, and then they start gossiping and you be like, okay, I have to go. And you
Right.
just because you've like said like I don't want to do that. And they're like, what's happened to her? Like what's wrong with her? It's like that's their problem. Like I know it's like I've had this boundary for around like gossip and so I'm doing my own thing. But oftentimes we'll be like, oh, so and so, like, we'll take it on and we'll want to fix it. It's like, so, like,
Mhm.
well, we don't really have any control over how people want to react to our boundaries. The other thing I would say is not everything requires a conversation. Sometimes we just change our behavior. And
Right.
then people pick up on that and then they know, oh, okay, like I guess that's the way that it's going to be. And the other thing is, we don't have to convince anybody of anything or prove anything to people. We can share our thoughts, emotions, and our feelings, but that doesn't mean everybody's going to be receptive to it. And we have to sort of take that on board as well. And if we can't be raw with people and authentic with people, or they're not receptive to our truth, I mean, I'm not saying like cut everybody out of your life or anything like that. Then maybe they're just somebody you don't do that with. It's sort of like, oh, okay, I know the type of relationship that we're, going to have, and that's okay. So this is a really big practice in accepting what is as it is in any given moment, and that's a affirmation that I pretty much work with all the time. It's sort of like if what I'm going to say going to improve on silence? Is it true and is it really necessary that I do this right now? And I check in with myself and I think, and if it feels really strongly that I do, it doesn't mean that I do it right away. Sometimes I wait until I'm not as wound up and then I'll be like, I kind of got upset or wound up about this thing and I really wanted to talk to you about it now that I'm like of a clearer mind and heart. Are you open to me talking to you about this X whatever topic is? And if someone's like, "Oh yeah, like let's dive in," then I'll share with them. So, but I always want to be conscientious of this idea that accepting what is as it is for what it is in any given moment isn't about bypassing. It's not about being like complicit or rolling over and being like, I can't do anything. It's actually radical witnessing. It's like, oh, this is what's going on, and just being present for it before we decide we need to do anything about it. Am I present? Am I really being present? Because a lot of us disassociate, right? That's a thing,
Mhm.
or check out, or cannot get so upset that we spin out. Like I just did this yesterday. I have to admit, I had a little spin out moment.
That's perfect.
Um, yep, I had a little meltdown. I had to tell my husband, I'm like, I'm spinning out. I know it's starting. I'm gonna spin out, and he's just like, okay, okay. I know what that means. Which it was meant there was tears and some frustration, but um, and that's another thing. Like, you have to be able to be self-aware enough to know when you're gonna spin out. And am
Yeah.
I always aware of it? No. Sometimes things, like, there's sometimes I do things and I'm like watching myself do the thing I told myself I wouldn't do, that I wasn't gonna do, and I'm like, oh, you're doing it again, and I'm like, so it's definitely a practice, I guess, is what I'm laughing, but is because we gotta laugh at ourselves sometimes.
We do.
Because it is a practice and it's not something that, I am awesome at all the time. There's some days I'm like, damn, you did a good job today. And there's other times I'm like, oh shit.
Today
Like,
could have been a little better.
so I'm gonna have to tell some people I'm sorry tomorrow because I just
I had a
had a
moment.
meltdown. I had a moment. Yeah, and I think that that's what integrity and authenticity is. It's like being able to be like, yeah, sorry about yesterday. I mean, I
Right.
just, and
Mm,
we don't have to, and that's working on that perfectionism thing, being able to loop back and own your shit.
right. And I think that's the hardest thing for a lot of people to do is take accountability for their lives because I've always been that friend that a lot of people would go to for all of their problems because to them, I seemingly had all of these answers. But I noticed that there were so many people that would come to me with the same problem over and over and over again. And it
Yeah.
was like, hey, okay, I listened to you the first couple of times, but this is what I think you can do so you won't keep running into the same issue. And a lot of times people will pretend like they're listening and then
Yes.
continue to do the same thing over again.
Yeah.
And then you have to have that same conversation with them. And then you have to look at yourself and say, okay, now at this point, if you're not going to take heed to my advice, I'm going to
Hmm.
have to take a step back here because I
Yeah.
need to protect my energy too, because this is emotionally draining for me. And
Yeah.
not it just not getting involved sometimes, knowing
Yeah.
when not to get involved in other people's issues.
Yeah, that's about, I feel like that's a boundary thing, and I definitely can relate to that. And one of the things that I do that's been really helpful is people don't always like this though, heads up, is I'll say to them, like, I know people who have people in their lives that don't treat them well. So for purposes of the conversation, it's like, oh, I'm dating so and so, and they continuously don't treat me well. And
Mhm,
then they come and be like, Emily,
mhm.
I need a reading. I'm like, no, you don't.
No, you need to leave.
No,
You need to
leave
leave.
him. Yeah, no,
Here's your
no, you
reading.
don't. And I'll be like, and rather than doing that, I say, I noticed that every time we talk, you mention that so and so is not treating you very well. What are you going to do about that?
What? What?
Instead of, I just don't commiserate, I just don't get into the conversation. I just will mirror back
Yeah.
exactly the thing that they've consistently been bringing up, and
Mhm.
I'll acknowledge and validate it. Like, I noticed that you keep bringing this up.
Right.
What are you going to do about it? Because
Right.
I don't need to do anything about it.
Exactly.
And it does work, I have to say. And that you can do that in a nice way. And they'll be like, oh, some people like don't even know that they've been talking about the same thing for 2 years. And it's like, oh my God, I didn't know I was always bringing that up. I'm like, yeah, every time we talk, you mention this.
Right.
And I'm here for you, but what are you going to do about that? You're the only one that can do anything. Now,
Exactly.
sometimes people will be like, Em, can you just listen? And I'm okay with just, listening. But there is sort of this boundary that I do have around, I'll give you 10 minutes, but and I'll just say, oh, I have to go now, you know,
Yeah.
and it's kind of a new thing for me, to be honest with you. I hate saying no. It's like
Mm,
there was a time it literally made me sick to tell
mm,
people no. And I don't know, you mentioned boundaries, and I'm gonna look behind me really quick. There's a book. Um, it's called, oh, it's not over there. Set Boundaries, Find Peace by Nedra Tawwab Glover, or it might be Nedra Glover Tawwab. I can't remember which. And she also has a book called Drama Free. Those books are she's such a clear communicator about, I didn't know how boundaries worked. This is
mhm.
like I'm like, nobody taught me. Like, it's not
Right.
something we actually I've never seen people in my like nuclear family that had healthy boundaries. It was just like kind of
Mm,
a free for all.
mhm,
And it was probably 5 years ago I was introduced to that book and I listened to it. And she has
mhm.
little things like, say this in this situation, and I'd try to say, and I'd be like, oh, that makes me sick to even think about, because of my perfectionism kicking in. Well, oh, they might not like me if I say this to them.
Right.
And she's such a clear communicator, and she's simplified these concepts into practical real life events that it actually made me understand, like, oh, that's how it works.
Mm,
This is how you can be when you kind of, because one of the things you can know if a boundary's been violated is irritation anger,
Mhm.
will start to
Yeah.
come up as like usually those this is not the only source of these emotions, but if you're around somebody who's not honoring your boundaries, you'll usually start to have intense emotions. That's your clue that you have not respected your boundaries. And you're the number one person that can do that. Like, you don't just go around telling people, respect my boundaries. If they don't respect your boundaries, all the more reason for you to keep them,
Right.
right? And maintain them through your actions because we don't have any control over their actions. And I know, like, that might sound obvious to people who are listening right now, but I didn't get that for the longest time. For some reason, I'm like, if I told people, like, oh, I don't stay in conversations with people who yell at me, that they wouldn't yell at me.
Mhm.
No, they'll probably yell at you, and then you uphold your boundary by leaving the conversation by saying, "Oh, you're yelling, so I'm going to go ahead and leave because I'm
Right.
not going to sit here and be yelled at." So I don't know. It sounds again simple, but simple doesn't mean easy. And those were two resources that really like something clicked when I read those books and listened to them as well. I was like, oh, boundaries, because it's kind of a buzzword right now.
It is.
And I'm like, what the hell does that mean?
Because people abuse them so much.
Mm-hmm.
And, we go in our day to day and we don't even realize how, we allow people sometimes to do things that are not that don't respect our values and our morals and those things. And we have to learn how to be able to implement them and uphold them, most importantly.
Yeah.
Because you can say, I don't like something, I don't like what you're doing, and voice it to that person. But if you're not going to make sure that you uphold that in that moment where they are not respecting your
Mm-hmm.
boundaries or your space or whatever it may be, then that's something that you have to look at and find
Mm-hmm.
ways where you are going to say what you mean and mean what you say and uphold that.
And I really believe that the more we can understand this practice of understanding boundaries and what works for us, the more we can actually be in the space with people who we maybe don't share views with, if that makes sense. Like,
Mhm.
because the reality is we're always going to have to interact with people maybe that we don't like
Right.
or we don't share views or values with. That's just the way that the world is.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I think is helpful in finding a bridge or that middle path of community and realizing, like, hey, we're all in this together in this world. We all need clean water. We all need food. There are things that bind us,
Hmm.
and we have to function together in a society, right? Is sort of understanding how your personal boundaries and what you can hold space for and what you can't. And I know that it might seem like how do those things relate, but I feel like that they really do. I know for myself, I have to be around people who's I don't share their values or they don't understand mine,
Hmm.
but because we maybe are all cultivating some healthy boundaries, we can see where we can work together, where things do flow. And that, I know people, especially after the election, are wanting to cut people out of their lives. And I do think that there is a time, and um, Nedra covers this in her books, like when you're at the point where it's like no contact versus, okay, I have to be in the presence of somebody who's difficult to deal with. How do I put myself in situations with them where I can feel successful and not overwhelmed? So there is an intersection there. And I think the more we understand that intersection for ourselves, the more successful we can be as a society and a culture. I can see it going from the micro to the macro.
Right. And I mean, this past election and just everything in general that's been going on these past couple of years, um, we've had to have some very uncomfortable conversations with
Hmm.
ourselves, with learning about ourselves and our values, but also with other people that we may love who may not share those same viewpoints. You may
Hmm.
have thought that they shared those viewpoints, but I really feel like this election really honed in on like,
Yeah.
there's a lot of people that have regressive thought processes.
Yeah. Hmm.
And, it's sad to see how far we've come to just take a million steps backwards.
Yeah.
And Yeah,
That's a really interesting thing. When you know how we were talking about holding space for our own fear and stuff like that.
Mhm,
So, on the personal level, and I'm going to connect this to the bigger picture, we have internal conflict. So, the things that often we don't like in others, they live within us. It's in us too, in some form or fashion. And for example, we can feel more than one emotion at the same time, right? And sometimes those emotions feel like they're in conflict with one another. A simple example would be is like you want to move to a different state. It's been a dream of your whole life, like, oh, I just want to live in Washington State, let's say. Because it is a Pacific Northwest fairyland here, I won't lie. Um, you have that part that's like ready to go, and then you have this other part that's like, oh hell no, I'm not ready, I don't have enough money, and they seem like they're in conflict.
mhm,
But if you kind of go on a deeper level, they both want you to be safe and successful. And so like there's the shared value. We want you to be safe and successful. We just one says stay, one says go. And
mhm,
then just by understanding that they essentially want the same things, it's like, oh, well, if that's the case, and I know that, then something in your system kind of shifts and there's not as much of that tension there. It's like, oh, we really ultimately want the same things.
mhm,
And I know that that may not always seem like the case, but I think usually people who are very wrapped up in being right or like this is the only way are coming from a place of deep fear. And underneath that fear is something that's probably actually some kind of protective mechanism, and that protective mechanism within them can actually do harm to themselves and to others. And so understanding our internal conflicts is actually a way that can ripple out into the world because we see it playing out all over the world, these conflicts, and it's like that is also within me. And so if I'm doing my work, then
mhm.
I'm at least one person that's understanding that sometimes when things seemed in total opposition, that they actually really aren't.
Yeah. And when you get in touch with what those fears are and start to work on it, you release that fear and you're able to deal with those past fears head on and
Yep.
move forward. And it can take you to different heights in the world. It can have you come into certain avenues in your life that you didn't even think that you could because
Yep.
you were so fearful of what could be.
One of the greatest, I read a lot of spiritual texts, and one of them was the Bhagavad Gita, and in it is a lot about attachment and aversion. And I was like, oh man, I get really attached to things needing to be a certain way, and I'm really averse to other things.
Mhm,
And when we notice our attachments and our aversions, which are very human, it's like we're always going to have them, but when we're like paying attention to them, that is really good information. Like, why is this? Why does it have to be this way is the only way? Or why do I have to have this thing, Or why is something literally repulsive to me? And being like curious, like, why does that repulse me? Could be a very good reasons why it does. And like, we're not judging the who's it's and what's it's and whys, but it's paying attention and noticing those things that can be really helpful. Because I know for me, my aversions lately have been things like I'm like, I don't want to hang around that person or I don't like that thought. It's like,
mhm,
oh, okay, well, I can't do anything about that, but why is it that I'm so opposed to that?
mhm.
What is that showing me about my value system or my needs as a person? And it's been very helpful to me. It's a lot, boy, that's a lot of fodder for your journal. I'll tell you what, paying attention to your attachments and your aversions is like, whoa, there's usually a lot there. At least there has been for me.
Yeah. And I really encourage for everybody to, hone into those fears, channel what those fears are and work on them. Because I feel like, well, I don't feel like I know this as a fact, is that there's so many people out there. I mean, obviously, we're all flawed people, but there's so many people who want to hold on to those attachments and
Yep.
somehow think that they can progress in the world without dealing with them. But part of the human experience is to learn and to grow. And the
Yep.
the best way to learn things is from our hardest lessons. And
Yes.
That's the only way you see it. If everything is all roses and fairies and rainbows
Hmm.
all of the time, you're going to look at life through one particular type of lens. But life is a balance between light and darkness, and we have both of those within us. And when
Yep.
we work on the darks, the shadow side of ourselves, we will become whole. We will become one.
Hmm.
So it's important to channel
The
that in that way.
scariest thing to me is a person who just thinks they're right.
Yeah.
I'm right. There's nothing more. It doesn't matter if they think they're right about a simple thing. It's like if once you think you're right or that you've found the answer, you've stopped you've stopped your personal growth and you've stopped your connection with self and the world, because the reality is that there is no fixed state. It's a constant evolution of awareness and cultivating awareness, which like takes that back to, if you have a practice of doing that with your intuition, that is going to bleed out into every area of your life in a remarkable and miraculous way that I believe leads to greater self fulfillment. And why else are we here other than to come to know this body and this self that we are only going to carry? It's only in our care for a little while, and then it's done, and then it's gone, right? And then I believe our soul passes on and our consciousness continues on. But this body is only in our care for a while, and it does give us this material, physical tool to understand the world and ourselves and our consciousness. And I don't know that we could do it without this physical life and this physical experience. And I think it was James Van Praagh, he's a famous medium. He says, living is hard, dying is easy. Because
Mm,
life is
it
life is
is.
hard.
Yeah.
It's the agony and the ecstasy in a lot of ways. And when one of my favorite poets, Mary Oliver, always says, joy wasn't made to be a crumb. So when we feel joy and when we feel happiness, soak it up, because
Mhm.
guess what? It doesn't last forever. The humdrum of life will return, right? And we'll have good days and bad days, but we have to soak it up, right? Soak it all up. And when things are bad, because things do get bad, right? Things get hard. I tell myself every breath is an opportunity to begin again. I don't know what the next breath will bring. And that kind of gives me a little bit of peace, particularly when, you know, you're having a hard time.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Emily, for joining me on this week's episode. It was a pleasure to have you on. Please share with everybody anything that you may be working on or how they can connect with you and get any
Mhm.
readings.
Yeah, so bloomingwand.com. I've got readings. Um, you can click the link to book if you want to, but I also have tons of free resources in the shop. I think the Blooming Wand podcast is an awesome resource. And on the next episode, we're going to be talking about dreams and
Ah,
exactly the Nine of Swords and exactly how to work on a dream journal to address your fear. So definitely checking out the Blooming Wand podcast is a great way to, I don't know, just get into your spiritual practice. And I'm always going to say get your journal out, because I think journaling is free therapy.
it is. And then you can look over things and analyze them a lot better.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, all right. Well, y'all heard that. Y'all make sure that you subscribe to her podcast, The Blooming Wand. And I want to thank all of my listeners for tuning in to another episode of Vibe Selection. As you already know, I'm your host, Kyra. Stay safe, stay healthy out there. Bye.